Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, a quick recap. In the previous class, we had talked about current source density, which is a way for us to go from voltage measurements, so which is what we get when we record EEG, to an estimation of where the charges are, which led to that voltage distribution. Okay, so given voltage, how to get charge? So the trick is as follows. From voltage, you can compute the electric field, which is basically just the gradient of the voltage. So it's this operator here is called the gradient operator, and it's basically just this. It's the derivative of the voltage as a function of x uh, uh, multiplied by the I vector. So it becomes a vector now pointing in the I direction, plus what you have here in the j direction and k direction. So it's a vector in three-dimensional space obtained from a scalar, which is the voltage. But then this voltage has to be available at many different values of x, y, and z. Okay, then only you can compute its derivative. So this is good. You find the electric field, but what do you do with the electric field? So turns out from the electric field, you can compute the charge distribution, which generates this electric field, and it's nothing but what is called the divergence of electric field, where you take a dot product with this del operator. Okay, so the dot product or the divergence here is just given by this formula. It's the derivative of v with respect to x plus the derivative of in the y direction plus the derivative of v3, which is the vector component of v pointing in the z direction. Note that v is a vector here. So this is the divergence. It's positive if there's a positive source sitting here, so that electric field lines are all going out. It's negative if there's a negative charge, so that all electric field lines are going in. And for these kind of electric field lines, it is 0. Okay, so if you put these two together, you get what is called the Gauss's law, which is that the the charge rho that you're interested in is nothing but the negative of the double derivative of VE of the voltage. So this thing is called the Laplacian operator. It's just the dot product of the gradient. So I've just put these two together, nothing else. This one and that one. And then you just put the operator given like this, and you will see that the final form is just this. It's the double derivative in the x direction, y direction, and z direction. You add them up and you apply it to the voltage and you get the charges. Okay, it's very straightforward. That's it. So if I give you a voltage distribution, let's see how this comes about. And this will also give a good answer to the way we defined the CSD earlier. Remember when we were talking about the CSD here, I told you that we need to just subtract the four neighbors. So let's see how this is. This is a very crude way of doing things. There are more advanced ways, but we won't talk about those. So suppose you've got, so this is example. So suppose you've got, an array of electrodes. One second. The color to black. So you've got an array of electrodes. The voltage here is V1, V2, V3, V4, and so on. Okay. And the distance between the two is D. So if I tell me what the derivative, the spatial derivative of this, and suppose this is the x direction, you try to estimate this. How much did voltage change as you moved, x? So what would be a estimate of the single derivative here?
V2 minus V1 by D.
Very good. So one estimate here is just V2 minus V1 by D. This one would be V3 minus V2 by D, would be V4 minus V3 by D, V1 minus V0 by D, right? So this is for this one, this is for this one, and so on. Now I say, okay, tell me what the double derivative is. So what would I do now? Whereas the same principle now applied to these things instead of V1, V2, V3. Right? No magic here. So the double derivative is just the single derivative of this. So at this point, it's just going to be V2. Sorry. So earlier you were doing V2 minus V1 by D. Now think of this as, some V prime here. No, prime is not a good idea. So I'll call this U3 and this is U2, this number here and this number there. So the double derivative is just now U3 minus U2 by D. Same logic as before. But when I put the values in, what does it become? It's V3 minus V2. Forget about D for a while. It's just as constant that will come out. Minus V2 minus V1. Okay, so V3 minus V2 comes here. V2 minus V1 comes there. What does it become? If I take the minus sign out, and it will become a D square will come out. It will just become 2V2 minus V1 plus V3. Okay, or even more simply, it will become something like minus uh, 2D square V2 minus V1 plus V3 by 2. Okay, so to get the double derivative along the x direction, all you have to do is whatever your voltage here is, you subtract the average of the neighbors. That's an estimate of the current source density. That's the estimate of the double derivative. Now, if instead of a line, you had a sheet, which is what you have when you compute EEG, you are also able to estimate the double derivative along the y direction, right? So if this is V1, V2, V3, and if this is V4, V5, your double derivative along the y direction is just going to be V2 minus now V4 plus V5 by 2. Okay. And in CSD, what are you doing? You're just adding those double derivatives like so. So eventually it just becomes some constant outside multiplied by V2 minus the sum of the four neighbors. Sorry, the average of four neighbors. This would be now minus 4 by D square. Okay, so this thing can be very easily computed. Don't get fooled by all this complicated terminology here. It's actually very straightforward. Now, there are all kinds of issues in actually estimating it like this. So this current source density suffers from a lot of reasons. And there's a very nice paper from Gaute Einegol's lab. A researcher who works on these things. They have come up with a more advanced algorithm to estimate this from the voltages, but we won't get into that. This is the easy solution. That's very easy to compute. Okay, in fact, you could compute that very easily, even using multi-taper. I believe there's an option to get the CST reference as well. So it's just that for each electrode here, you just take the average of the four neighbors and subtract it, and you get CST estimate. Okay, and this is a good estimate of where the charges are. So if all the electrodes were picking up the same activity, so it was not localized, then the CST would have been 0, because the average of the four is the same as what you have in the middle. Only when there's a gradient like this, things tend to fall off, then you see a non-zero charge distribution. So now we can move forward and formalize the source localization business. And here we won't talk about too much of physics. All the physics that we talked about is all here. So if there are no questions, I'll move on. Otherwise, if there are questions, I'll take them now. Okay, so let's move on then and talk about source localization. This is one of the very well studied and very classic problems in EEG literature. That if I give you voltage distribution, can you tell me where are the sources that generated that? Okay, so now let's talk about it first from a biophysics point of view. What are we talking about here? So, as you remember, the origin of the extracellular potential comes about because synaptic activity or other types of activity opens ion channels that generate local sinks, and those currents that they come in go out from other parts of the neuron, generating a distributed source, and the separation between sources and sinks produce these dipoles or higher order poles, and these are what produce the voltage that you record outside. Okay, in fact, there was a formula that we saw. It's the transmembrane current divided by 4 pi sigma, which this was the permeability of the medium. Okay, sorry, in this case, it would be the conductance. So that's one current source. Now, like your LFP, you need to have a lot of these dipoles aligned together to form a measurable signal. So pyramidal cells in which which are large and have aligned dipoles contribute to the LFP as well as EEG. In particular, now note that the location of the dipoles, whether they are on the gyri here on the cell side, they also matter. So in this case, for example, if you are in a sulcus like this, the dipoles here and the dipoles there, they're pointing in different directions. So together, they tend to cancel out. So the sulci actually won't produce much of measurable signals. But if you look at a gyrus, where the electric field lines are all aligned and there's nothing canceling them, they will produce a bigger signal on the scalp. It's very interesting that if you look at a complementary technique called MEG, magnetoencephalogram, where you look at induced magnetic fields, not the electric fields, there actually the sulci produce a stronger signal because the magnetic field lines are orthogonal to the electric field lines. So if this is the electric field, the magnetic fields are going to then become like this, and so will be these ones, and they will produce a signal. The gyri will have magnetic fields that are pointing in parallel to the surface. They'll produce a weaker signal. So EEG versus MEG actually look at complementary sources. Okay, so we won't talk about MEG in this class, but it is a good, interesting thing to note that one picks up the sources in the gyri, for picking up sources in the sensor. Okay, so the reason why this is a complicated business, going from the sensor to the, sorry, from the source to the voltage here, is because you've got multiple things, the CSF, the skull and the scalp and the skin, and they all have different conductances. Their conductances are not the same. And that actually complicates the relationship between the charges that are sitting here and the voltage that you get here. Remember, if it was isotropic, which means so if the conductance was the same everywhere, it would have been just a relationship like this. You'll have some form of dipole here, and you divide by the conductance, and then it becomes easy to solve it. But otherwise, it's a difficult thing, and I will show you how it is done. Okay, so if I have the voltage traces, you could say, okay, tell me where the sources are. So here are the sources in the brain that are producing this voltage, set of voltages on the scalp. This is the inverse problem. And then the forward problem is, given the sources or the charge distribution, tell me what the voltage is going to be on the scalp. Okay, both are hard problems, but this is at least a well-defined problem. This we will see is an ill-posed problem because there are lots of charge distributions that can produce the same voltage distribution on the scalp. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about voltage forward problem. I did some of this in the other course as well. The introductory neuroscience course. So you may have, some of you who have taken that course may remember this. So here's the question: given a dipole source, what is the potential at the scalp? Okay, and as I said, it's a straightforward thing for us to do. If brain was homogeneous and isotropic, I'll tell you what it means in the next slide. But it's not, and that is what complicates things. Turns out brain, skull, and skin have different conductivities. In fact, thing to remember is that skull has very little conductance or very high resistance. If you look at the ratio of the scalp versus the skull, different people have given different ratios, but at least it's around 20 or so, 20 or 25. So, say, right, the thick skulled, I guess it's not thick skulled, it's thick skinned. So that analogy doesn't work, but, skull has poor conductance, and that complicates things. And then there is another problem, which is anisotropy, which means that the conductance is not the same at different directions. Okay, so if you look at the The skull, it itself has a hard layer and a spongiform layer, and the conductance along this direction going through the hard layer is much lower than the conductance along this XY plane. So the conductance is not a scalar, but it becomes actually a vector. Okay, it becomes a tensor, uh, which further complicates things. Okay, so nonetheless, given in spite of these complications, let's try to see how we would go about solving this. Any questions till this far? If you have questions, please stop me anytime and ask. Okay. So here's the question now. So I'm going to have one dipole, a single dipole sitting somewhere in the brain, like so. It has some magnitude and some direction. And the head is modeled very simply as a set of concentric circles, or sorry, concentric spheres, each having a different conductivity. Okay, so this is a three-layer model. So you've got the brain, the skull, and the scalp as three uh, concentric spheres, one between the other, one inside the other. Sometimes a fourth layer is also added, which is the CSF, and they all have different conductivities. Right now, we will just assume that the conductivity is not a vector, it's a scalar. And then I've put a dipole somewhere in the middle here, and I want to know what's the potential at some point on the scalp. Okay, outside, what is the potential given this dipole? So how do we solve this problem? Now, turns out it's a very complicated problem. Even in the very simplified case here, it's actually a very, very hard problem. But people actually have spent a lot of time on this problem. So I'll tell you what people have done in the past. This is not a very popular method anymore. Now we have fast computers which can be used to solve these things numerically, and we will talk about that in a bit. But remember times when computers were very slow, and people had to come up with smart analytic way of solving these things. So how do we do this? So we need a couple of boundary conditions for us to be able to solve this. So the first condition is that you cannot pile up charge somewhere very easily. Okay, so charges in general are very hard to pile up. You would rarely see a positive charge sitting by itself. So this is a monopole, for example. Uh, we talk about monopoles all the time, but in nature, in general, isolating and holding a charge like this is very hard. Typically, what ends up happening is then there is some other charge nearby which sort of neutralizes this. So a capacitor, for example, has positive and negative charge separated by some distance. Even in the brain, we don't usually have monopoles, we have dipoles, current sources and sinks, because it's very hard for us to pile up charge somewhere, especially at the interface. So which means that all charge that leaves one compartment must um, uh, enter the other compartment, which means that if I'm at an interface where the conductivities are different, sigma 1 and sigma 2, now these are the two conductivities, the charge or the current that is going through in one direction must be equal to the one that you have in the other direction. Now, I can compute the currents from the electric field using this formula. Okay, it's the conductance multiplied by the electric field is what is called the current density. It is a vector like electric field. So what this formula here is saying is that if I look at the component of the electric field, which is orthogonal to the boundary, then the current that is going through on this side, which is J1 dot product with En, is the same as the current that's entering on this side. And then the current is given by sigma 1 times that the gradient of the voltage in this direction. And that's going to be the same as J2 dot product with En, where J2 is given by sigma 2 and the gradient of V2. This gradient is the electric field. Okay, so I'm just putting all of this together. And this gives me a relationship between the voltages on this side and the voltages on that side. Okay, it's called the Neumann boundary condition. And this sort of relates the voltages that you have on this side with the voltages that you will have on this side. Okay. So that's one boundary condition. The other boundary condition here is quite trivial, that if I look at the scalp here, and this is the air here, then obviously no current can just vanish in thin air, right? So no current can be injected into the air outside the human head, because the air has no conductivity, it's very low. So the current density at the surface of the head is just given by this. It's zero here because no current can go out into the air. Okay, so this also tells you how the voltages can be at the scalp. They have to satisfy this condition. This is called the homogeneous Neumann boundary condition. And then the third condition that you have is that the voltage at the interface cannot suddenly jump, because if it suddenly jumps, the gradient is infinite. The derivative is going to be infinite, and you can't have infinite number of current. So at the boundary, the voltages have to be the same. Just before this and just after this, the voltage has to be the same. Okay, there cannot be a discontinuity in the voltage, because then its derivative is infinite. Okay. This also has a name, Dirichlet boundary condition. And these tell you together that even if you have multiple layers, sigma 1, sigma 2, sigma 3, the voltage distribution has to satisfy certain conditions, these three conditions. And turns out with these three conditions, you can work out what the voltage is going to be if I put a dipole somewhere here. What the voltage is going to be somewhere there on the scalp. Any location on the scalp. You can solve these and get to it. Unfortunately, the solution is very complicated. Okay, the poor fellows who didn't have fast computers back in the days actually did it the hard way. This is all math here. This is the voltage at any location on the scalp, and it's given by this formula here. You might be wondering what's G and what's X. Well, G is this. Now you might be wondering what is X, and it's all given here. Okay, and then you need to have legendary polynomials and associated legendary polynomials, and you can read all of this. I'm not going to even try to explain this. It's extremely complicated even for a very, very simple case, which is that of a concentric circle. Okay, just goes to show that you can do it, but it's a very hard solution. And it's still a very approximate, very simple solution where think of the head as a concentric circle, nothing more. Okay, or the head has three concentric circles or four concentric circles. Even in this simple case, it is almost impossible to actually work this out properly. So nowadays, people do more realistic, have a more realistic description, but it is not possible to get an analytic solution. This is an analytic solution. You don't have to numerically work this out. You can actually mathematically work this out. But this is for a very simple case where these are concentric circles. Nowadays, what people do is as follows. You say, okay, I'm going to have a model of the brain and a model of a skull and a model of a head. And then for these three tissues, the brain, skull, and head, which have different conductivities, I'm going to parcel it into small surfaces. Okay, this is called a boundary element method, where I just divide the surface, a particular surface, into certain meshes. So these are, you can see these are meshes, and you'll have one set of mesh for the brain, one set of mesh, one mesh for the brain, one mesh for the skull, one mesh for the head. This is called the boundary element method. There's another more complicated method called a finite element method, where you think of the three tissues as volumes, not as meshes or sheets. So the FEM is numerically even harder to solve, but it can deal with tissue anisotropy because you are looking at it as a volume, not as a sheet. Here you can't have anisotropy, but you will be able to deal with the fact that these three have different conductances, but not that the conductance itself varies looking at depending on which direction you are. So it all looks very complicated, but note that numerically you can always solve the Neumann boundary conditions and all that for each mesh. You can always talk about how much current is going to flow through the mesh and go in different directions and so on, and also orthogonal to the mesh to the other mesh, which is the skull, through the other mesh, which is the head, and so on. So numerically, it's a very hard problem, but conceptually, you are just solving different surfaces. So conceptually, it's straightforward. Mathematically, numerically, it is hard. You need a computer to solve this. But the conceptually, it's easy. If you have a dipole, it's going to generate potentials, and you have to just make sure that all these conditions are satisfied along any two boundaries. Now you have got a ton of boundaries here, but so you have to numerically keep solving this. But once you do that, you're done. Okay, so this is what is called a head model. Head model is something that you choose. What do you choose? You either say, I'm going to use a boundary element method or a finite element method. And for each of these methods, you have to choose how many meshes you want. And then numerically, there are different algorithms that are used. So they will, then you choose that also. But once you are done, you have, once you do that, you're done. You've got a head model, which you will use to, um, set up your boundary conditions and then solve the forward problem. Okay. So now let's put this together. So this is going to be a complicated thing, obviously, but just numerically complicated. Conceptually, it's straightforward. You just keep solving the boundary conditions, and it will give you the voltage at any point given a dipole somewhere in the brain. Okay, you just need to solve this numerically. So now let's put this all together and think about how you would go about solving the problem, which is that given a dipole somewhere in the brain, how do I find out the potential at some location on the scalp? So let's see how we would work this out. So consider a dipole, which is both a magnitude given by d and a orientation given by this, at some position r dipole inside the brain. Okay, so you can define the potential at any point r due to this dipole given by this formula. Well, it's not a formula, it's a it's a function here. G, which is given by which depends on both r depth, r and d. Now, I'm not telling you right now how you would solve this, but suppose you had this access to this function. So then you would just find out what the potential is because of this one dipole. Now, because this Poisson equation is linear, if you had a bunch of different dipoles, the potential is just going to be due to the sum of all those individual contributions, given like this. Again, I don't know how to solve this, but if you had access to this function g, you would have just trivially found out what the potential is, which is the contribution from all these individual dipoles. They just add up. So I'm going to write this in a matrix form. Now, suppose you've got p such dipoles. So the voltage at location R1 is just this multiplied by that plus the next one multiplied by that plus that next one multiplied by that and so on. So it can be written in a vector form. At a location R1, it's just going to be this thing multiplied by that in a vector form. Okay. And if you have n electrodes, you do the same for each one of that. So you've got now a column vector of n values. This is the potential at a given time at, let's say, n is 64 locations. So it's a 64 cross 1 matrix. And suppose I say I have, 10 dipoles. So there is going to be, this is going to be a 10 cross 1 vector. And this matrix is just going to be a 64 cross 10 matrix. Okay, so each element here tells you the tells you the voltage that you will get if you had a dipole of some magnitude sitting at a location r depth, having an orientation e. The orientation is captured here. When the potential here is you want it at a location R1. Okay. Now, really, I could have either maybe a single dipole or maybe 5,000 dipoles. The number of dipoles here is different. And also, if I say that each dipole has 3 orientations, then the size here would be thrice. For like 10 dipoles, you need to specify 30 numbers. For each dipole, the magnitude in x direction, y direction, and z direction. But you can always do that. The matrix size will increase, but otherwise it remains the same. So what is known right now? I only know the voltages. That's all I know right now. But I should be able to estimate this matrix. And then given the dipoles on this side, I can compute what the voltage is going to be on this side. Okay. So I'm just mathematically formulating the physics that I have done here. If I have t distinct time points, so if I have a voltage trace, the whole thing just scales up and you have a time series of dipole distributions also. At each time you'll have one vector which will tell you what the voltage will be at that time. Time is now a vector here 1. And if you give me a time at a different, if you give me a voltages at a different time point, I'll get another column vector. And that's just going to be the product of this matrix with this vector here. Okay. So this matrix is the key. And this matrix is called the gain field matrix. Gain field matrix or gain matrix or field matrix. If you knew the gain field matrix, which is very hard to find, but you can find it, you would have solved the forward problem completely. Because the voltage is just the product of the gain field matrix and the dipoles. So if I tell you what the magnitudes are, you can tell me what V is. All you need to know is G. Usually you also add, because the data is noisy, you also add a noise term here. But the noise is independent of everything else. So mathematically, you would just formulate this. All you need is G. If you know G, you can solve the forward problem. Okay, so let me just write this down. N cross T is the number of T is the number of time points, 1024 time points for example. In our data, it's some 400 something. So G is the gain matrix or lead field matrix, comes with, in different names. Its size is N cross P, number of sensors multiplied by number of dipoles. And then D is the dipole matrix and N is the noise matrix. To solve the problem, forward problem, find G. That will give you the forward problem. The inverse problem is harder because there you are given V and you have to find D. Then you need to somehow invert G. And we will see it's not an easy thing to do in most of the cases. But we will talk about that also, in the next class. But basically, that's it. This is the proper formulation of going from the sensor space V to the source space D. So we will now see how the whole thing is put together in an example. Okay, so let's get to that. Now I need to determine D, where the sources are, and there are a couple of different approaches that I could use. So here's the idea. The activity of each neuron can be considered as a dipole. So there are billions of such dipoles, right? So there are billions of Ds. Each neuron could be a dipole. However, to produce a measurable signal at the scalp level, you need to have a lot of these dipoles properly synchronized. So effectively, there might only be a few large effective dipoles that are generating this potential. So you could do it two ways. you could either say, okay, I'm going to only assume a few dipoles, but I'm going to estimate the position, orientation, and magnitude of those. So in this case, my formula becomes something like this. Uh, this is a column vector, it's a 64 cross 1. Let's just think about one time point. Here, it's a very small matrix. It will only have, let's say, 3 dipoles, so 9 different elements. But you don't know their locations. So you don't know what RDIP is. You don't know their orientations, and you don't know their magnitudes. So you actually don't know the gain field function, which depends on these variables. However, even if I consider all of these as variables, I'll have a finite number of variables, and I can solve this because I have sort of 64 equations here, right? So all of these are variables, but I could try to solve it and find out the position, orientation, and magnitudes of a few dipoles that will give me a voltage distribution which is very close to the actual voltage distribution that I see on the scalp. This is called a parametric approach, and we'll see an example of that in the next class. But before getting to that, I'll tell you about a non-parametric approach also, which is very popular, in which you have a bunch of dipoles that are fixed in position and fixed in orientation as well, like this. So I'll say that, okay, my brain has a ton of dipoles. Let's say I have 10,000 dipoles. Okay. Position of the dipole is fixed. So if I put a unit dipole here, I can do all the math that I talked about. Once I specify a head model, I can actually compute the estimated potential at any point. Okay, so if I put, because the location and orientation of the dipole is fixed. So if I say I'm going to put a unit dipole here, I can estimate. It's a hard thing to estimate, but I can do it by solving the boundary conditions, blah, blah, blah. And I can estimate the potential at any point, which means I can actually pre-estimate what G is. Okay, now it's a very difficult thing. I've got a 64 cross 1 thing here. So this is now going to be a very fat matrix. 64 cross 1000 or 10,000, let's say. And I've got 10,000 dipoles here. But I can solve this before starting anything else. And then say that once I have this G, can I find some D values which will give me this V vector that I have. Okay, so in a non-parametric system, what do? I create a head model. I create a source model, which basically tells you where and how many of these sources are located. I need to provide information about the electrode locations, where those 64 electrodes are. This is my source model. This R1 to R64. This is my electrode position. And to compute G, I need to have a head model which tells you how you are parcellating the brain, skull, and head. Once I have all of this, I can estimate the gain field matrix. Okay. And then if I can somehow invert the gain field matrix, I will be able to find out what D is given any V, which is my inverse problem. Okay, so I highly recommend that you guys go through these, there are these couple of workshops on this. I've put the references here in the beginning. Where is it? Yeah, here. Sorry, this is field trip. The references, yeah. If you go through these two, it will very clearly explain what we are trying to do. This is hard to understand mathematically, but I would really recommend you guys go through this. Very easily explained, very nicely explained, and it will take care of the stuff that we have discussed today, and we are going to discuss tomorrow in the next class also. Here's just to, there's a lot of stuff that I have talked about today. So I'll just give you an example. You can actually do all of this yourself in using this MATLAB code, display source localization that is provided to you. And it tells you step by step how to solve the, the inverse problem. So you start with the MRI data. So you take the MRI of the subject and this is how it looks like. If you don't have a if you've only done EEG but not MRI, you could take a standard template and assume that is the structure of anyone's brain. Then you find the different segments, and this is some parcellation algorithm that is used. So this algorithm now has found the brain here, and then the bone and the scalp. Okay, so those are the different models that you are going to use. And the field trip algorithm provides the details. So I really encourage you to go through this. It makes a lot of sense when you are doing this in MATLAB together. So brain, skull, and scalp, it's going to parcellate based on the MRI data. And then you create a head model. So here you have some choices that are given, and it creates a head model. Which is these little brown meshes that you see. I hope you can see the brown meshes here. And then you say, specify the electrode locations. You have to tell where each electrode is. So for the 64 electrodes that I have, these are the locations of these electrodes that I have specified. Okay. So I gave this algorithm information about the electrode locations, and I chose a head model, which means it had a way of parcellating or putting a mesh for each of these different surfaces. And I also gave a source model, which tells you where my dipoles are. So this is a non-parametric method. So I've got a ton of these dipoles. But if I put all of this together, this algorithm will give me a gain field matrix G. So in this case, it will be a 64 cross 10,000, let's say, matrix. But then if I put a dipole anywhere, I'll immediately find out what the voltage is, as long as the dipole location is one of these. And if I can invert G, I'll be able to find out the dipole distribution for any potential distribution on the scalp. which is what I am after. Because remember, my main question is, given the voltage distribution, where are the gamma generating sources? Okay. So in the next class, very quickly, I'm going to talk about different ways in which we solve the inverse problem. Okay, it's an ill-posed problem, but different algorithms are used which have different assumptions to be able to find the source distribution given the scalp distribution. Okay, so I'm done for today. I'll stop recording. If there are any questions, please ask now.
Is CSD a kind of quantitative inverse problem solving method?